In this video, we're going to explore how to use multiple databases in a Django application. And I think this is actually fairly common. Your app might have a primary database, but there might be additional data sources that you're pulling data from. And these could be legacy systems that your application is integrating with, as one example. Now, I've just worked on a Django application that pulled data from a remote Oracle database and stored some of that data inside a local MariaDB database. So it was pulling data from Oracle, transforming it in some way, and then storing that data in MariaDB locally, along with other data sources that were coming into the application. And I think one other common use case is to separate read and write operations in the database. So for example, you might send writes to one database and do your reads from another. So we're going to explore a multiple database scenario in this video. And we'll also see the inspectdb management command in Django, and that's used to auto-generate models against an existing database. And we'll also look at database routers in this video, and these give more fine-grained control over which models and which application models connect to which database in your app. And finally, at the end of the video, we'll touch on data synchronization, and that can be used when you need to create relations to external objects. We're going to just touch on that briefly at the end. So let's dive in. If you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi page in the description. And also, it would be great if you would give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. So let's dive in. Now I've got the Django documentation open here on a page for connecting to multiple databases. I'll leave a link below the video. So there are some additional steps that you need to take if you're connecting to multiple databases. Now in VS Code, I have a very simple Django application, and it's a project called multi-db demo, and it has an app called core. We're going to keep it simple in this video, and we're going to use SQLite as the database. And we're actually going to connect to two SQLite databases, but all of these concepts are going to work with other relational databases that Django supports as well. So let's imagine a scenario where we have some kind of educational app and we want to show course materials to students. And our Django app is going to define the details about the students. And in order to do that, we're going to create a model in this application, and that's going to be called student, and that'll inherit from Django's own models.model class. So we'll create that model in a second, and the application is going to track those student details. But imagine that the course materials themselves are defined in some external database. And that might be provided by a third-party vendor, for example, or it could be some other source inside an organization that's large, such as a university. So we want Django to have its own local database, but we also want to connect to a remote database. So we're going to need to define two database connections in this video. And another example of this might be if the lectures or seminars for each course are defined on a third-party database. We might want to read that data into the application, but not necessarily have the ability to write any of that data. But we want to read it, and we also want the application to be able to perform its own functions. So we're going to define two databases for that. Now let's start with the default database, and that's where the student model is going to be stored. So I'm going to copy the one field that we're going to use in this model. So the student's going to have a name, very simple, it's a car field. And let's also give the model a _string method to return the student's name. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to expand the terminal, and I have a database.sqlite3 file on the left hand side. So I'm going to delete that, and let's generate a fresh database here by running manage.py. Now we're going to run make migrations so that our new model is going to be picked up in this application. And then we're going to run the migrate command after that. And that's going to then create the local SQLite database. Why is it creating an SQLite database? If we go to settings.py and we scroll down, we have a setting here called databases. And that by default, when you set up a Django project, has the key of default in the dictionary, and that maps to a local SQLite free database. And you can see the file name for that here. It's db.sqlite. That's what's created on the left-hand side. So at the moment, this Django application using this databases setting can only connect to one database. Now, in order to define multiple databases, we need to add additional keys into this databases dictionary. So we're going to do that just now, but what I'm going to do in this project is I'm actually going to drop another SQLite database that I prepared into the root directory here. So I'm going to paste that in here on the left now, and you can see that that has appeared. It's called courses.sqlite3. So imagine that that is our external database that contains data for courses at this university. So we have another database, we need to add that to our databases setting. So let's add a new key into the setting, and we'll call this course DB, and that is going to be another dictionary where we define the actual settings to connect to that database and any options we want to define. So I'm going to copy the settings from default, but we obviously need to change the file name here. So that's going to be courses.sqlite3. The engine that we're connecting with is going to be SQLite because that's the same database as we're using for the default. But if you're using Postgres or MySQL or something else, you can define the correct engine here along with any connection details. So now the databases setting has two databases defined here. What I want to do now is I want to show how we can take this course database, and that is something that exists somewhere else remotely perhaps, and we want to generate automatically Django models for the data in that database. So I'm going to go to the terminal here. So let's go and expand that. And let's just create a dedicated application here for these models. So I'm going to run the Django python manage.py command, and it's the startup command that I want to run. And let's create an application in this called courses. So in this imaginary system, this courses application in the models.py file, this is going to contain all of the functionality that's related to this external database. So let's go back to the command line. And on here, I want to run the inspectdb command. We're going to see what that does in a second. Before we do that, we need to take this new application that we have, and we need to go to settings.py, and I've forgotten to add that to installed apps. So let's do that at the bottom of the installed apps setting. We're adding the new courses application. We can now go back to the terminal, and what I want to do is run python manage.py, and this command is called inspectdb. Now I want to quickly go to the Django documentation on how to integrate Django with a legacy database. So Django is of course best suited for new applications, but it is possible to integrate it into legacy databases. And the inspectdb command is one of the most important utilities you'll need to know if you want to automate as much of that process of integrating with a legacy database as possible. So after you've defined your database parameters, which is what we've just done, you can auto-generate the models using inspectdb. I'll leave a link to this page in the description of the video. And the inspectdb utility creates models by introspecting an existing database. So if we run that, we get some output, but we can actually redirect that to a file using this syntax here. So I'm going to do that just now. And let's go to the terminal. So we're going to run inspectdb, and we want to redirect the output to models.py, and that's within the courses application. Now, before we run this, remember we have two databases in our application. So when we run inspectdb, we want to actually tell it to connect to the CourseDB database. So we can pass this database argument, and we can set it to a value that's defined inside of our databases setting inside settings.py. So let's now run this, and we're going to see hopefully that that redirects the models that it's auto-generating into this file. So let's minimize the terminal and go back to models.py. And this is in the courses module, and you can see we now have some content in this file, and that has been auto-generated by Django. So let's have a look at what's here. We have a class called courses course, a bit of a confusing name, but the reason for that is because the application is called courses and the model itself is called course as well. You can see it's linked to a DB table here in the meta class using this DB table attribute, and it also has managed set to false. Now we can change the name of the model that we have here. So I'm just going to call this course. That's the only one that we need here. And because it's got the DB table, we can actually name the model anything we want. The DB table is going to tell Django which table under the hood to actually look at when grabbing the data for this model. So this has been auto-generated from our courses.sqlite file. And we also have a Django migrations table. We can actually ignore that. We don't need to look at that. We're going to focus on this course table. So there's only a single model here, but you can see the power of the inspectdb command. So imagine you have a database with about 50 or more tables, very common scenario, and you need your Django application to integrate with that database. So imagine having to write all of those models out from scratch using just the knowledge that you have of the table and the columns and the data types. That would be very difficult to do. This is a utility, inspectdb, that can really help you with that process. Now I want to go to the documentation on this managed equals false option that you see here within the meta class. So what exactly is that? So it defaults to true, and that means when it's true that Django is going to create the appropriate database tables in the migrate command, and it's also going to remove them as part of the flush management command. So in other words, Django is managing the lifecycle of that database table, and that's the default scenario when you use migrations. But if managed is set to false, then no database table is going to be created, modified, or deleted when those operations are performed on that model. And that's useful if the model represents an existing table or a view in the database that has been created by some other means. And that's the only difference when you have managed set to false. So what I'm going to do here is go back to the terminal, and remember we have managed set to false here on this course model that's been auto-generated. So I'm going to clear what we have, and let's run python manage.py, If we run the make migrations command here, we're going to see that a migration is created for these two models that have been auto-generated. So I'm going to look at the migration file just now, and we're going to see, if we look at the initial.py file, that we have the create model operation in this migration file, but notice that the managed false option is here, and that exists as well for the Django migrations option. So let's now run the migrate command. So it's python manage.py migrate. And when we run that, it's applying this migration file. But the question is it going to create a course table under the hood in SQLite inside the default database? So what I want to do is look at the default database, which remember is just db.sqlite. So I'm going to open that just now in VS Code. And if we explore that database, you can see that if we go down here, I don't know if you can see that well, but we don't have a courses course table here. We have a course student table, and that's the one that we created in the core application. The rest of the tables are default tables created by Django. So even though we have that migration file that's been created in the courses application, and that's this one here that you can see, that migration has the managed false parameter available in the migration file, and that tells Django that we don't want to actually manage the life cycle of these models. So it's not going to then create that database in the default database under the hood. I hope that makes sense. Just to go over it in a nutshell, we have a course model here that is not managed by Django. This is coming from an external database, and we've generated the model using the inspectdb command, and that automatically sets managed to false, which means that Django is not going to be involved in the management of that table, but we can still use the model in our application. So we're going to do that just now. I'm going to close some of these files, and let's go to the views.py file, and that's in the core application here. So what we have is a very simple Django view that renders an index.html template. And what I'm going to do at the top is I'm going to import both of our models. So let's paste these in here. We're importing the student model from the core application and the course model that was auto-generated, and that's in courses.models. Let's import both of those. And inside the context dictionary, I'm going to create a couple of keys here. The first one's going to be for the students that we have in the database. So that's going to be students.objects.all, and that should be singular, not students. And then we're also going to create a courses variable here, and that's going to be course.objects.all. So basically we want to fetch all of the students from our database, and we also want to fetch all of the courses from the other database that we have set up. Now I'm going to add a comment here, and this operation is actually going to fail at the moment, and that's because there is no course table in the default database. Remember, that exists in that other database. And by default, when you run these commands in the Django ORM, it's going to look at the default database unless you tell it otherwise. Now I'm going to save this file, and we're going to go over to index.html, and I'm going to replace this content here with some content that I'm going to copy paste into the template. So it's basically two UL tags, one for courses at the top, which uses a for loop to loop over all of the courses, and then we have exactly the same for the students below. So I'm going to save this, and let's go back to the terminal. And we're going to run the server. So it's python manage.py run server. And once the server's started, we can go to the browser. And when we go to the browser, we're getting this error here. There's no such table called course in our default database. That makes sense because the default database, that's the one that contains the student model. And we saw that that did not contain the course model. That's coming from the other database that we've set up. So the question now is, how do we actually use the courses.sqlite3 file? In other words, how do we use this second database that we've set up here inside the database's setting? So in order to use that in a query in the Django ORM, what we can do is amend what we have here. And let me remove this comment for now. So as well as .all, I'm going to chain another function here called using. And here we can pass the alias for the database that we want to actually connect to in order to perform this query. And the alias is CourseDB. That's going to match what we have here in the key in database's setting. So now we're using that database, and if we go back to the page here, I'm going to refresh this page, and now you can see we get back some results. We don't get back an exception. And these courses have been auto-populated from that other database that I prepared for the video. So imagine connecting to this third-party database. We've auto-generated the Django model, and that's using inspectdb. And now we can query that database. It's not our default one in the application, but we can call .using here to pass the alias for the correct database that we want to use when we are using this course model. So in this view that we have here, we're actually sending an SQL query to two different databases in order to get the data we need for the view. And that can be very useful, again, if you have these multiple data sources. Now I want to move on to another topic now, and that's database routing in Django. And I think this is quite an advanced topic, but it's very useful to know about if you have multiple databases. I'll leave a link to this below the video, but basically the easiest way to use multiple databases is to set up a database routing scheme. And the default routing scheme that Django has ensures that objects remain sticky to their original databases. And importantly, and this is the one we've just seen, it ensures that if a database is not specified, then all queries are going to fall back to the default database. So that's what happened to us here when we just used courses.objects.all. We didn't specify a particular database, so the default routing scheme in Django is going to use the default database when that's the case, and that's this one here that looks at the database.sqlite3 file. But we wanted to look at the other one, so we had to specify that explicitly here. But imagine that we have an application, as we do in this project, called courses, and we want all of our database queries for any models that are inspected and generated into that models.py file to use the course database. We don't want to have to write this statement here every time we do this. That's error prone. We might forget that and it could blow up the application. So instead of using that for every model that we have in this courses models.py file, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a Django database router, and we're going to tell Django basically if the model is coming from the courses application, then we want to use that course.db by default. So let's create a new file here, and I'm going to just create this in the core application, and it's going to be called dbrouter.py. And if we go back to the documentation, we're going to see that to define a database router, we need to write a class in Python that provides up to 4 methods. So we have db for read, and that's going to suggest the database that should be used for read operations for objects of the type model when the model is passed in. And we also have db for write, very similar for write operations. We can also add methods here to this class for whether or not a relation should be allowed between 2 models. And finally, we have an allow migrate option as well. If we scroll down further here, we're going to get an example use case here. So imagine, as you can see here, we have multiple databases inside the setting. We can define what's called an router class, and that provides those methods that we saw above. So what I'm going to do right now is go back to our file, and we're going to write a class here called dbrouter. And we're going to copy the top method that we have here, and that's called db for read. In fact, let's just copy the entire body of that. And we're going to go back to VS Code and we're going to paste that in here. So we have a method called db for read, and we're going to amend the functionality here of this method. So what I want to do is check if the model's app label is equal to the core application that we have in the Django project. And that's this one here. And remember, in the core application, we have the student model, and that's in the default database. So we want to tell Django via this router that if the app label is core, we want to use the default database. So we're going to return that alias for the default database here. And then after that, we're going to add an else statement. And I'm going to copy this statement here and we're going to paste it in, and we're going to change the name of the application to courses. So what we're saying here is that if the model that's being passed into this function here, if it's in the application called courses, we want to return a different database here, and that's the course.db. And that matches up to the setting key that we have for that database inside the database's setting. So let's just quickly go over this one more time. We have a method in the router called db for read, and we can remove this comment, it's not relevant. What this is going to do is it's going to check the model that's passed in, and that's going to be passed in anytime you run a query in Django. It's going to look at the model's meta class and the app label, and if the app label is going to be core, we want to use the default database. Otherwise, if the app label is courses, we want to use that other database called course.db. And I'm going to copy this method. We have a very similar one for db for write, so we're just going to change the name of this method to db for write. And again, core application models should use the default database, and courses models should use the course.db. Now, if you're using inspectdb to look at an external database, it's possible you actually might not want the models that you have there to be able to write into that external database. So you can amend this method here if you want to prevent the models in the courses application, as one example, from being able to write into that database. So now that we've defined this router, we need to tell Django to actually use it. So we have a dbrouter class. We're going to go over to settings.py, and I'm going to go to the bottom of this. Django has a setting called database routers, and that can be a list of different routers. We're going to pass in a path to our router, so it's in the core application. It's in a dbrouter.py file, and the name of the class is dbrouter. So we're just telling Django about that class. And when we pass that in as the only router, it's always going to use that for any database queries. So I want to test this out. If we go back to views.py and we remove the call to .using, we don't need to explicitly say that anymore. And that's because the course model is in that courses application. And if we look at dbrouter.py, when we do a read query, such as .objects.all, if the label is courses, we're automatically going to use that for the model. So if we go back to our page here, remember we got an error when we didn't use .using before, but now that we have the router, when we refresh that, we don't get that error. And that's because Django knows this is a model that's in the courses application, therefore it now knows to use the course DB. So that's all working nicely, but imagine that we have to create relations between the students and the courses. That's a common thing you might want to do in an application. A student is enrolled on particular courses, you're going to need a relation to encapsulate that. But we have a problem here, and we're going to see that problem now. If we go back to models.py, the student model, let's try and add a foreign key to the course model, and we need to import that at the top. So we've imported course, and we're creating a foreign key between the student and the course that that student is going to take, and we can specify that this can be null. Now the big problem that we have here is that the student table in the database, that's in a different database than the course table. And if you want to enforce referential integrity with foreign keys, your tables have to be in the same database. So to highlight this problem, what I'm going to do is stop the server and we're going to run the make migrations command. That's going to create the migration file, and then we can run migrate, and it's going to run that migration. Now, if we go to the Django admin, we're going to try and add a student, and we're going to see the problem now. So what I'm going to do is create a super user here, and we can run the create super user command, and I'll create a user called admin here. Once that's created, we can run the server, and I'm going to load up the Django admin. So I'm now on the Django admin, and we can click the students model here, and we're going to try and add a new student using the admin. So let's just give the guy a name of John Doe, and we're going to select one of the courses that we have in the database, and we're going to click save here. Now we have a problem. We cannot assign this course because the database router is preventing that relation. And again, the problem here is that the course database table, that's in a different database than the student table. So we cannot connect them up reliably using a foreign key, and Django is preventing this, and you can see that message here. But what if we need relations between these objects? Now there's different ways you can approach this. We are connecting to two databases, but you might want to have a scheduled task using Celery or something that's going to pull down the data from that second database and store it locally in this Django database so that you can then create the relations between the objects. So basically in that approach, you need a Celery task to actually synchronize the database from that external database down to your local database. And you can do that every 1 minute. You could do it every day, every week, however often your application data is going to change in that external database. So that's a decision that depends on the data. And that's a process called synchronization, or you could call it replication as well. What I'm going to do is walk through a very quick example of how you might take the data from the external database and store it locally into the Django application. So I'm going to go back to the core applications models.py file here, and we have a class called student. What we could also do is add another class, and we're going to call that local course, and that will inherit from Django's normal models.model. And we want the course to have a name field, and that's going to be the name of the course. And then also we're going to add a _string method. So I'm going to copy this one, and let's just paste that below here. So we now have a local course model. And the idea here is that we want to connect to our external database, and we want to copy that data and store it locally using this model here. And that's a process that should be scheduled using Celery beat. Now what I'm going to do is stop the Django server, and we're going to run make migrations to actually create this local course model. And then we can run the migrate command after we've done that. And when we run migrate, it's going to create that table in the default database. So let's minimize the terminal. And what I want to do in the core application is I want to create a new folder here, and that's going to have a management command in Django. So it's going to be in a management/command folder. And I think it's pluralized actually, so management/commands. And what I want to do here is create a new file called synccourses.py. And this is going to contain a Django management command. So I'm going to paste in some of the imports, and we have a function here, a method, within the command class called handle. So what we've imported is the base command from Django, and that's what you inherit from when you create a custom command. We've also got command error. I don't think we need that. And we're also importing the course model that we have in our courses application, and we're importing the local course model that we've just defined inside the core application. Now this might be slightly confusing. You probably wouldn't have a local course model inside a core application when you also have a courses application, but I'm just going to roll with that for this demo. Now within the handle method, what we want to do here is take our external courses. So we're going to create a variable called external courses, and we're going to call course.objects.all, and that's going to fetch all of the courses from that second database, the one that we're not managing in the Django application. And then we can loop over each one of those external courses. So we can create a for loop here, and for each course in those external courses, we are going to create a local course object by calling the update or create command. And what we're going to pass here is the primary key, and we're going to set that equal to the course.pk. And I'm going to pass a defaults argument here, and the name of the course, we're going to set that to course.name. So what's going on here, we're looping over each of the courses from the second database, and we're creating a local course object if it doesn't exist. Or if it does exist, we are potentially updating that object using these defaults here. Now the defaults here, that's a dictionary that's used to actually update the object when it already exists in the database. So basically what's happening here is that we're going to create a local course with the same primary key as what's in the external database. And we're going to look to see if the name has been updated each time we are in this for loop. And if the course has a new name, it's going to issue an update command to the database. And that's going to keep the default database in this Django project in sync with that second database, or at least it's going to be in sync whenever this command is run. And again, that might be once a day, once an hour, it could be once a week, depending on your external data. So let's try running this now. I'm going to go back to the terminal. It's going to be python manage.py, and the name of this file is sync courses, so we can specify that here. Now nothing has happened here, but what I want to do now is go to the core application's admin.py file, and I'm going to copy this line of code below, and we're going to register our local course model into the admin. So let's do that just now, and then we can start the server and go back to the Django admin. So I'm back on the Django admin now. If we look at the local courses, you can see we now have 5 of these, and these have been synchronized from that second database into the application, and now we have them in this local course model, and that's a model that Django is managing. It's in the same database as the student model, and therefore we can create these foreign keys and other relations between objects. So in order to create those relations, let's go back to models.py, and where we have the student model, I'm going to change that to reference the local course instead of the external course. So let's do that just now, and I'm passing a string in here just because the local course is defined below. So we now have a foreign key to a different model. Let's stop the server, run make migrations at the bottom, and then we're going to run the migrate command, and that's going to make that change to the database. If we then run the server and again go back to the Django admin, what I want to do is go to the student model that we have here, and let's try adding a new student here called John Doe. This time we're selecting a course from that local course table, and this time when we hit save, we do not get the error that we got before. And that's because we're now synchronizing that data from the second database into the same database as the student model. So we can now create relations between the objects. So if you need to do that and you're not just pulling external data down, then you might want to do some kind of synchronization step into your local database in the Django project, or at least into your main database. And if we go back to views.py, what we can do at the top, instead of using the course model from the external database, we can use the local course model here and fetch these courses using that model. And that should continue to work. If we go back to the main page in the application, you can see we still have those courses, and we also now have our new student, John Doe. Now, one thing I want to note here just before we finish the video is that if you're just doing a synchronization step from an external database, you might not want to run the inspectdb command and auto-generate models for those. That's just going to take up space in your application, and if you're synchronizing that data down, you can just use the local copy after the synchronization is finished. So you might not want to generate models using inspectdb in that scenario. So what we could maybe do instead, if we go back to synccourses.py, this is the management command that you would call periodically with Celery or some other tool like cron. The line of code we'd need to change is this one here that's fetching the external courses. So instead of using an unmanaged model here, we would just fetch that using some SQL and get the data from the external database or the other database that we're using SQL. So what I'm going to do is just paste in some code here. So I'm going to change the entire file, and we can minimize the terminal, and we can see what we have here now. So we've got our local course model. Of course, we need that to insert the data into our new local table. But this time, instead of some unmanaged model, we're just importing connections from the Django.db module. And this time in the handle method, we are using the connections dictionary. We're getting the cursor from the course DB. So again, we're using that setting that we have in settings.py. And if we go back here, let's have a look at that. We have a databases setting and we have two keys, two different databases that we're connecting to. So we want to connect to the one that has the alias course DB. So in order to do that, we have the connections object and we are getting that out of there. And then we call .cursor and that gives us back a cursor object that we can execute SQL queries on. So we're executing a query here to get the ID and the name from the courses table inside this database here. And this is using the Python database API, so it should be familiar to you if you've ever used these tools. Once we have executed the SQL query, we can call the 𝗏𝗀𝗀 function on the cursor, and we get back a set of rows that we can then iterate over, and we extract the course ID and the name from each row, and that's the two fields that we have in the select query. Once we have the course ID and the name, we can then issue the same call to update or create, and pass those values in. And that's again going to handle that synchronization between the courses database and our local default database. So if we go back to the Django admin console here, and what I'm going to do is go back to the courses page. So for the local courses, what I'm going to do is just delete all of these so we can remove them all. And then if we go back to the terminal in VS Code, I'm going to run the command again. So that's going to be sync_courses. And we've got an error here. We don't actually have a command in this file. I think I've deleted too much here. My apologies for that. At the top, we need to import the base command again. And this handle method should be within a command class. So we're going to define that again now. And I'll tab this over. So we now have this within a command class. If I try to run the command again at the bottom, hopefully this time we're not going to get an error. And then when we run the server and go back to the Django admin, if we refresh this page, you can see we now have the courses. So that synchronization is now working just by using an SQL query. We don't need to inspect DB and generate models. It depends on how your application is using data from these other databases. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. We've covered multiple databases in Django and how you can define these with the databases setting. We also looked at the inspectdb management command for auto-generating models against an existing database. We looked at database routers for fine-grained control over which models and application models connect to which databases. And finally, we looked at the end here on synchronizing data from a second database into your main or default database. And that can be useful if you need to create relations that span across databases. So you take the data that's in some other database and you bring it locally, and you can then create those relations using that technique. And there are many different ways to approach that last task. That's just one example, but that's going to be all for this video. If you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi link in the description, and it would be great if you would give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.